Morning. I'm a senior consultant for INTAL. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this new INTAL Talk. It's a series of talks organized for the IDB and the INTAL. They are topics, strategic topics for the IDB. In this case, it's food security, the debate of the agenda in the international arena and in Latin America, specifically in terms of international terms. Before introducing the speakers and giving them the floor, Ana Vasco, the Intel director, will give you will speak an opening speech. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here to the second Intel talk that we are organizing in BID Intel in the trade sector. Thank you, Diwakar Dixit and Paolo Giordano. I would like to thank them for their participation. We know that they have a tight agenda, so thank you very, very much for your availability. I think that everybody knows here um, knows about the importance of food security. And of course, this has been aggravated because of climate change and as the pandemic, war, and inflation that came as a consequence of those things. I would like to talk about the reasons and the motives in which food security is very important for the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. Because first, because we have 200 million people in poverty, living in poverty. They don't have daily um, food. And today the region has a very important role in agriculture exports. 16% of exports come from Latin America and the Caribbean. Third, because we have increased potential of exports, which is very, very important. We have some research in which we can see how Latin America can increase their participation in international trade. Paolo will talk about this. Here, for example, we have some woods here, and also we have growing potential in or other regions. And I think it's a very relevant topic because what we see is that we have more regulations and provisions that try to reduce climate change effects in developed and developing countries that can affect food goods or good. For example, a Green Pact Act in Europe with deforestation, and we have some research that show how that can affect different goods. All people here know how trade is so important in terms of food security, in terms of access to new markets, to good, and the reduction in prices. And of course, the importance of technology transfer that is very, very important in terms of efficiency and agricultural efficiency. And of course, we know that costs are an issue, and Paolo is going to talk about this. We have trade costs that are relevant to this, and we need to strengthen new agreements, and we need new agreements here in the region and outside the region, and in order to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers. And what we see that food security and this challenge is linked to different causes. So it's very relevant to face it from different aspects where trade is central to this issue and to take care of small farmers in terms of funding and technical issues. It is important to deal with vulnerable populations, which are the ones more affected by food insecurity. and the more resilient aspects of this, and that don't affect climate change, and this has to do with green value chains. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope we have new ideas, and of course, then we can ask Diwakar and Paolo some questions about this in order to have a more inclusive, fair, and sustainable region. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna, for your words. Before introducing the speakers, I will give two recommendations. You have simultaneous interpretation for this talk. There you have you can choose the channel. Diwakar will speak in English, so we have translation into Spanish. And while the speakers are talking, you can write your questions on the chat, and at the end of both talks, we can ask some questions to them. I'm going to introduce the speakers. Diwakar Dixit is a counselor in the Agriculture and Commodities Division of the World Trade Organization, where he has been working since February 2006. Mr. Dixit is the secretary of the WTO Committee on Agriculture, which monitors the implementation of members' legal commitments under the agreements on agriculture. He supports the ongoing agriculture negotiations towards further opening of the global agriculture markets and assists the acceding countries on agricultural matters. He also handles the food security dossier in the WTO, including the participation of the WTO in various international organizations. Prior to joining the WTO, Mr. Dixit was a part of India's team at the permanent mission of India to WTO in Geneva during 2002-2006. Mr. Dixit holds bachelor technical degrees from the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. Paolo Giordano, in turn, is a senior economist in the integration and trade sector at the IDB, an Italian national. He holds a PhD in economics from Sciences Po in Paris, graduated from Bocconi University in Milan, and completed his executive education at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Two speakers with a lot of experience to contribute to our debate. So, Diwakar, you have the floor for your presentation.
Thank you very much for these kind words and introduction. Let me now share the screen.
Yes, it is okay.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you so much, and good morning and good afternoon, good evening to those who are connected to this event. In this session, I will like to expose the role of trade, international trade, in global food security debate. This will be broadly the outline of my about 35 minutes of this presentation. I will focus mostly on the later two in view of the time constraints, because I understand what is meant by food security, and the linkage between international trade and food security is not such a difficult thing to grasp. So I will focus more on the later two element, that is what is going on in the WTO on the topic of food security, and then focusing more on the recent conversations and also the divergences that we are facing here among the membership. Okay. Now, in terms of the meaning of the term food security, I think many of you may know that this is relatively a young notion. The terminology food security came to be known only during mid-70s, when we had the first officially announced global food security crisis. And since then, it took almost 25 years for reaching an understanding of food security that you can see on screen, that is taken from the 1996 Bird Food Summit. And if you read this, it talks about all people at all times having physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And I think it is very difficult to find an undertaking, a challenge described in one sentence, which seeks to address perhaps one of the most protracted challenges we are facing currently globally. Now, if we dissect that definition into elements, I think normally we refer to these four elements: availability of sufficient quantity of food, either from domestic production or via imports. Then access of individuals to food, that means they have the means, the resources to acquire food. Utilization, which refers to the nutritional well-being of humans. And here we talk about adequate diets, and then also access to safe water, health, sanitation, and so on. And finally, stability. That means a sudden shock or crisis should not disrupt access to food. So this is broadly the four elements which describe the notion of food security. It is still evolving, I think, concept. If you look at recent conversation in the Committee on World Food Security in Rome, there have been suggestions to also add this notion of agency, because they say that the definition talks about all people. So that means no one should be excluded, and therefore everyone should be somehow involved in the decision making or some sort of empowerment. And then, since the definition refers to at all times, and stability normally refers to some sort of short-term stability, and therefore if you look at longer-term stability, then the definition should also entail a notion of sustainability. So you can see it's a highly encompassing notion. It is very hard to find one agency or organization claiming to deal with this multifaceted theme in its entirety. I think to address food security, collaboration across various stakeholders should be the norm, and therefore I think events like this are very useful to understand who is doing what, and so that we can synergically contribute to this complex problem. Okay, now let us look at international trade and food security. Normally, trade can contribute to each of these four elements, which I just referred to: availability of food, access to food, utilization of food, and stability. However, the most, I think, obvious and rudimentary way to link trade to food security is by referring to this balancing role of international trade. As we know, our nations or countries are not divided by equally dividing natural resources in a mathematical way, or those resources to be aligned with demographic considerations. And therefore, there are so many countries on this planet who simply cannot produce food commensurate with their domestic consumption needs. Some countries almost rely 100% on imports to meet their food needs. So therefore, it is very easy to visualize how critical international trade or functioning supply chain, global supply chains are to meet food security needs. But the role of international trade is not just limited to this balancing or conveyor belt role. It can play a much bigger role as an engine of economic growth and development. And in order for that role to be realized, trade should be fair, market-oriented, free from protectionism or distortions. And that is where the role of the multilateral trading system, or the WTO, comes into play. And that is what I said in the beginning will be my focus as to how we in the WTO deal with this aspect of food security in our work. Okay, so I will first start with multilateral framework of rules that we have in the area of agriculture. As you may know, agriculture has been a very sensitive theme or topic in the multilateral trade discussions. When the GATT was created in 1948, that was the inception of the multilateral trading system. It was just after the Second World War, and there was a strong resistance at the time, or there was a very limited preparedness of countries to subject their agricultural sector to full-fledged competition. And rather, they were seeking sort of policy discretion and autonomy in dealing with the agriculture sectors, both in terms of border policies as well as internal measures and subsidies. So they, in GATT, they created some very carefully crafted exceptions in order to retain that free hand. And that you may know the history of creation of GATT itself, because it was not supposed to be an independent agreement, and rather it was supposed to be subsumed into a bigger scheme of things, which was called Havana Charter or International Trade Organization, which never realized. So GATT remained in existence for almost 5 decades as a provisional agreement. And it was an agreement of the executives. It was not supposed to be taken to parliaments. And that's why naturally it has the so-called existing legislation clause, where any law or regulation which had existed at the time of the signing of GATT, even if it was inconsistent, it could continue, because you cannot force countries to change laws when parliaments were not involved in signing on to this instrument or to agreement. And many countries used several features, several policies in the domain of agriculture using this grandfathering or existing legislation clause. So that's more or less the history. But members had made several efforts to bring agriculture into multilateral fold, but it took almost 50 years before this could happen in the form of what we currently have, the agreement on agriculture. It resulted from the 8th round of, those of you who follow WTO, or GATT. We have this concept of rounds where over a period of time members agree on a sort of negotiating agenda, and they conclude that over that time, 2 years, 3 years, sometimes longer. So it was in that setting, it was the 8th round of negotiations, which was launched in Uruguay, in the place called Punta del Este, which took 8 years, which was one of the longest round, I would say, and perhaps one of the most ambitious, comprehensive round on any economic policy matter. It resulted in the agreement on agriculture, but many other agreements, and also WTO as an institution. So it was one of the most fundamental round of negotiations held under the auspices of GATT. So under the Agreement on Agriculture, which is currently applicable, it entered into force in 1995. It broadly covers 3 areas. We commonly refer to them as market access, the pillars of market access, domestic support or domestic subsidies, and export subsidization or export competition. Now, the round, because of the sensitivity many governments had, it was concluded. It took very long, and agriculture was quite responsible for that. And when it was concluded with an explicit acknowledgement that it is an unfinished business. And they added or included in the text of the treaty, text of the agreement, this continuation clause, saying that this is an unfinished business, and members after 5 years will engage in negotiations to improve them, to deepen these commitments. So that is how this agreement came into being in 1995. Now, some, I think, very important decisions could be made in the Uruguay round, which are part of the current framework, and which have also an important bearing on food security. As I said in the beginning, international trade, fair trade, market-oriented trade can positively influence all 4 dimensions of food security. So one important achievement of the Uruguay round is in predictability of international trade. As you may know, in WTO, we rely on this concept of tariff bindings or tariff ceilings. And for agriculture, at the time of the Uruguay round, it was realized that there was a huge hesitation among governments to engage in tariff negotiations to commit to these tariff bindings. Tariff bindings means the ceilings beyond which applied tariff cannot go. Okay, so the important decision in the Uruguay round was that entire agriculture sector as defined in the agreement. I mean, you can see it primarily chapter 1 to chapter 24, leaving out fish and then certain other products. They said the entire agricultural sector or all agricultural products shall be subject to tariff binding. So it was quite a fundamental decision they could take, a big political step, I would say, because it is in this aspect, agriculture is far ahead of industrial sector. In the industrial sector, industrial goods, there are many countries who have very limited binding coverage. But when it comes to agriculture, the entire membership has comprehensive tariff binding coverage. That means each and every agricultural product has a tariff binding. They can also take another very important decision to get rid of non-tariff measures and rather rely on tariffs or duties at the border to regulate imports. That was another very important change which happened. They entered into what some of you might have heard, this process of tariffication. That means converting the then non-existing non-tariff measures into effective tariffs and start from there to reduce them and put them into what we call schedule of commitments. So that was, I think, quite a big achievement in that negotiations. Another important contribution of the Uruguay round, and which now is part of the rules, is creating a level playing field and having a robust framework on domestic subsidies. Those of you who know how GATT and then later on even the WTO had dealt with subsidies, we have this approach of dealing with adverse effect or negative effects of subsidies, and by providing what we call remedies to affected countries. So that is the general approach that has been there in multilateral trade disciplines. That means having an effect-based remedy to affected countries. So, but for agriculture, they chose a very innovative, almost having no precedence, a framework where they agreed to set up binding self-disciplines on the use of subsidies. That means they agreed to have a set of disciplines on how they would conduct their agricultural subsidies. That means not relying on effect in having the discipline, rather having the discipline upfront in the form of a self-discipline on how they will provide or undertake agricultural subsidization in their agriculture sectors. So that was a very different, new, almost like a novelty. And how did they do that? Very broadly, I mean, we don't have a lot of time to go into detail, but very broadly, they categorize subsidy into two broad categories. One, those which would be deemed as presumed to be having limited or no or minimal negative effect on others. And then the rest will be deemed as trade distorting and therefore should be limited. So one set of policies would be support policies would be deemed as exempt from any monetary limitations because they do not have any negative spillover effect, and on the other hand simultaneously limiting the recourse to other subsidies which would be presumed to be causing negative effect. That's broadly the framework, and that has eventually created a sort of international template of subsidy reform. So that means countries were invited to orient their support increasingly towards these so-called exempt subsidies, and which under the WTO type of system we use these boxes, basically inviting members to increasingly use green box subsidies. So that created sort of template, and if you look at now the support structure of virtually almost any member, major members like US, EU, India, China, Argentina, Brazil, you will find that the biggest share of subsidies in the agricultural domain is indeed in the green box. So that has introduced, I think, a big change in the thinking that members can take care of their agricultural sector, meet their developmental objectives, but still organizing subsidies in such a manner that their negative impact is minimal. And then other subsidies which are deemed as trade distorting, we refer to them as amber box subsidies or AMS. This is aggregate measurement of support. They are subject to reduction commitments. So that is more or less what will to be achieved in the Uruguay round, and which is currently part of the current framework that we have. And as I said, this agreement was reached with an explicit acknowledgement that this is an unfinished business. The reform has to continue through negotiations. And those negotiations indeed commenced in the year 2000. And as you may know, in 2001, members collectively agreed to enlarge the negotiating agenda in the form of Doha Round or Doha Development Agenda. And agriculture negotiations 1 year later got subsumed into that. I think for the first 10 years, I would say quite a significant progress was achieved. At one stage, membership was very close to reaching an agreement around 2008, 2009. But then since then, some changes happened in globally as well. Global food crisis of 2007, 2008 being one of them. Since then, the negotiating dynamics have become very difficult, a lot of divergences. And in 2011, the ministerial conference, which was held in Geneva, ministers acknowledged that the divergences are very deep, and it looks very difficult that membership can collectively reach an agreement on all these negotiating agenda in the form of what we call single undertaking, and they rather invited membership to approach the various negotiating topics depending on whether the progress can be made on them or not. So that means this whole framework of single undertaking was removed in a way. And since then, since 2011, the negotiations in agriculture have been not really bound by this single undertaking. Rather, members have been focusing on issues where progress is deemed as feasible. And it was in this setting that an important agreement was reached in 2015 when members collectively agreed to eliminate agricultural export subsidies. So out of the three pillars which I mentioned, in the pillar of export competition, I think one very important decision was achieved in the negotiation where members eliminated agriculture export subsidies. In fact, in the year 2022, the entire membership was able to bring their positive amount of subsidies. I think 20 members had them to zero. So schedules on agriculture subsidies were brought down to zero subsidies, leaving out a few members who are in the process of legal formalization of those commitments. But otherwise, everybody is already bound by zero subsidies in the area of agriculture. So that was an important achievement. But now the focus is on the remaining issues, which is market access, domestic support, and then some specific issues like public stockholding. And here it is fair to say that divergences are quite acute. Okay. Now, if we look at WTO framework of rule and from a food security perspective, I could put some of these main elements coming from the framework of the WTO. One, the system itself, a rule-based multilateral trading system anchored by these WTO rules in itself is a global good, propelling prosperity and rising of income globally, and which eventually obviously help global food security as well. More specifically, we can refer to the rules in the area of agriculture. I already gave you a sort of overview of what we currently have in the agreement on agriculture. Now, we have always got from the very beginning, I think, when the WTO was created and this agreement on agriculture was established, was negotiated, we had specific attention to the most vulnerable countries, least developed countries, and net food importing developing countries. That focus had existed in the Uruguay round, and eventually there was a decision taken by ministers in 1994, which is commonly referred to as Marrakesh decision on NFIDCs and LDCs. And probably that may be the only place in the entire WTO legal framework where it talks about potential negative effect of the WTO reform process or WTO rules on agriculture, those negative effects for these set of countries. And the idea was that the reform process will eventually improve the prices. They had been depressed because of the distorting intervention and so on. And when these prices go up, those countries who are excessively reliant on import to meet their food needs, at least temporarily, their cost of food, cost of accessing food may go up, and they may be becoming more vulnerable. They may face some financial challenges even for commercial imports when prices go up. And they took some actions under that decision. The decision legally is not part of the agreement on agriculture, but the WTO Committee on Agriculture has been mandated to follow up on the implementation of this agreement, of this decision. What decision does broadly is to look at international food aid architecture. When we talk about international food aid architecture, some of you may know there is a legal framework in the form of international burden sharing, in terms of countries coming upfront to help others and providing non-commercial food aid. Now, interestingly, the origin of that framework, which is commonly called Food Aid Conventions or FACs, now this is called Food Assistance Convention, it originated in 1967 in one of the GATT round, which was the Kennedy round. It was the GATT membership which came up with this idea of this burden sharing agreement for non-commercial food transactions or food aid, and then eventually it went to another organization called International Grains Council, where this treaty or agreement is implemented. Under that, several parties are there which have committed to a minimum quantity of food aid or food assistance every year, which they provide to the needy countries. Because of the close involvement of the WTO membership, or rather the GATT membership at the time, in this framework, this convention has been specifically referred to under the Marrakesh decision, where members said that we will work closely with the Food Aid Convention framework to ensure that there is enough amount of food aid to account for the food needs of LDCs and net food importing developing countries. The decision also talks about technical and financial assistance to these countries so that they can enhance their productivity. And from the legal perspective, the decision says that whenever the WTO membership achieve agreement on export finance, or what we call export credits, export credit guarantees. I understand you may know how these programs work. When we talk about export credits, these are the initiatives by the exporting country governments or agencies to provide credit to the buyers in importing countries. So it's like assisting the buyers by providing them lucrative terms and conditions in order to promote export. That's how these export credit and guarantees work. But from when we talk about trade in food, and when the other side, when the importing country side is least developed countries and net food importing developing countries, the decision says that in those cases, whatever rules are agreed, they should have some special dispensation for these countries, because the rules eventually which were to be agreed will be in the framework of export competition. That means governments of exporting countries should not outcompete each other by using these credits and guarantees, which are better than market terms. But for food, and when the importing countries are LDCs and net food importing developing countries, the decision says that their conditions should be taken into account and some special dispensation should be created. That was indeed taken into account when in 2015 members reached an agreement on export subsidies and export competition, and there were separate rules on export credit and guarantees. Specific rules were agreed for least developed countries and net food importing developing countries. For example, the general rule says that whenever exporting countries are providing credits through their credit agencies, the term of the tenure of the credit should not be more than 18 months. But for when the other side, when the importing country is a least developed country or net food importing developing country, the rule says that this tenure or the length of the credit can be up to 36 to 54 months when the product concerned is a food product. So for trade of foodstuffs, these countries, LDCs and net food importing developing countries, have a specific dispensation so that the rules in the area of export competition should not happen to constrain access of these countries to food. So that was the thinking in this Marrakesh decision. The decision also requires the WTO to engage with international financial institutions so that the commercial imports, the financing needs for commercial imports of food should be taken into account. That means expectation is that these financial institutions should have windows and mechanisms allowing especially the LDCs and net food importing developing countries to benefit from those windows in order to import food. So this is broadly the structure of that decision. I think this later part of financing can also be very relevant for IADB being an important financial institution and your engagement already in the domain of food security. In addition to the agreement on agriculture and these instruments which I just talked about, there is also important role of the two agreement that we have in the WTO treaty dealing with food safety and quality. This is the agreement on SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and technical barriers to trade, or TBT, because food which is not safe and not of good quality, of course, cannot be consumed. So these rules, I think, relate very directly to the utilization component of food security. Very broadly, these agreement, what they do is they allow, they provide the freedom to the governments to apply measures to ensure that the food safety is maintained, food is of good quality, and these public policy objectives are met in these regulatory domain, and simultaneously ensure that the trade in of those products is not unduly disrupted. That's a balancing act that these two agreements do. They rely very heavily on international standards. For example, under the SPS agreement, you may know that there has been now a sort of legal recognition provided to the international standards. For example, in the area of food safety, standards by Codex Alimentarius Commission are now provided a legal recognition. That means a member following those standards will be in the trade of food, relevant food products, will be presumed to be within their WTO commitment under the SPS agreement. So that is how these standards have been somehow mainstreamed into the legal framework under the WTO. Very briefly, I wanted to mention that. And then finally, also one of the newest agreement that we have under the WTO treaty, the trade facilitation, which seeks to reduce trade costs and primarily from custom and regulatory measures. And that could be very relevant because there's one, for example, provision in the trade facilitation agreement dealing with perishable goods, like, for example, fruits and vegetables. And the agreement says that these goods, these products should be cleared by the customs immediately without delay. Even if the office, for example, is required to be opened outside hours, outside typical office hours. So these are some of the rules under the WTO framework, which may be quite relevant for global food security. Okay. Now, let me now go to the challenges, because so far you have heard all good things, what we are doing and how the framework relates to food security, but picture is not as simple and as positive as it may seem to be from the points I made thus far. There are also some serious challenges that we are facing now currently, and obviously they also relate to the food security debate. First, obviously, you know, some important achievements were made in the Uruguay round, which are part of the current framework of rules under the Agreement on Agriculture, and what they are contained in the schedule of commitment on duties and subsidies and so on. But the reality also simultaneously is that this sector still has a high level of trade restrictions and distortion. They persist till today. For example, in agriculture, it is not very uncommon to find tariffs in 3 digits. And that is why, because of these high tariffs, members in the Uruguay round took recourse almost in a systematic manner to tariff rate quotas, which are eventually 2-tier tariffs where there is a high tariff prevailing, but simultaneously at least a limited quantity of trade should be permitted at a lower duty. So this is what is called tariff quota. Under the legal system that we have, tariff quotas are lawful, they are legally consistent, they are not quotas because market is always open at the higher tariff. And their reliance is primarily because the tariffs are very high. Exporting countries, for example, your region, Argentina, Brazil, all the big exporting countries, they don't like tariff quotas, but these are accepted as a reality, because if you don't have them, then the current level of tariffs may not allow trade to take place. Another thing to be kept in mind with regard to tariff is that a lot of conversation has now gone out of the WTO building, and members have been relying more on free trade area negotiations to improve market access. This is a relatively new development, a bit ironical, because the system was created primarily in the beginning for liberalizing tariffs and opening trade, but that component is almost not discussed in a negotiating framework. There is very, very mute conversation on reforming or liberalizing tariffs now. Some countries, specifically from your region, they are pushing this agenda. They are having high stakes in reforming tariffs. They are not such a big player in the FTAs. They need multilateral framework, but still the reality currently is that that conversation is still in a very, very, I would say, mute state. Efforts are being made. So the focus in the WTO is mostly on reforming subsidies, because it is almost impossible to reform subsidies in a preferential setting, because there is no motivation to do so, because these subsidies are not directional. They don't have any direction. So it's hard to negotiate them in a limited or preferential setting. So the focus of the current negotiations is on reforming subsidies. Now, as I was saying earlier, that we have a very innovative, almost like a novelty in terms of the current framework on subsidies, which has no precedence. But the major achievement of the Uruguay round was to create that framework in terms of reducing subsidies, especially the harmful subsidies, which are not minimally distorting, rather they are having a negative spillover effect on others. The limits on them are still very high. And that was because it was such a politically sensitive topic. Achieving a framework itself to reduce subsidies over a period of time was a grand achievement, but actual reduction in those subsidies was very limited. The richer countries, the developed countries, reduced those subsidies, harmful subsidies, what we call amber box subsidies, by only 20% in the Uruguay round. And the developing countries who were having these subsidies more than what we call de minimis, they reduced them by only 13.3%. And that's the current limit that exists. So that is a sort of a big priority area in the current WTO conversation, to further reform these subsidies. And this has been a very challenging endeavor. I will refer to that, why this is challenging. Now, another complication that we face is that now many countries, especially from the developing world, they're talking about some sort of perceived inefficiencies or even inequities in the current rules, and they are seeking to address them. I mean, obviously not everybody shares that view, but there is a big body of members who talk about these inequities in the current agreement, especially with regard to the subsidies framework that we have, or the domestic framework, domestic support framework that we have. And I will just go to that very quickly. And that is leading to very serious divergences. So even if the subsidy reform is the main topic of current negotiating conversation, the divergences are so acute that the progress has been very, very slow on that. Now, the third challenge that we have from the food security perspective is that now many importing countries are raising the issue of export limitations or export restrictions, because for the last many years and decades rather, the focus of the governments of the members have been to address protectionism, which still is a big challenge, and they have not been able to, I think, orient their attention toward the export side of trade policy or export restrictions. The current rules are, in fact, the fundamental rule still is contained in the GATT 1994 in Article 11, which allows countries to impose export restrictions, for example, on foodstuffs to relieve or prevent critical shortage of foodstuffs. That means these measures are imposed on food security grounds. Now, on the other side, if you look at importing countries who have been relying on international trade to acquire food, to access food, obviously their food security may be compromised. So it becomes a politically very heavy conversation, because the countries who are imposing these measures are invoking food security to impose these measures, and the countries who are negatively impacted are also basically relying on their own food security needs. And the question in the negotiation then becomes whose food security is very important. And it's not an easy conversation, and there is a realization that members need to come up with a practical solution where there could be a balancing of interests and food security interests of both the exporting country and importing country. And this is now very much in the center, or very much in the negotiating table, from, for example, looking at some years ago when this was not really the main topic of conversation, but now it has come to the main table of negotiations. That's the third issue, again, challenge I just referred to. least developed countries and net food importing developing countries, as I said, from the very beginning, their concerns have been identified, and they also are specifically raising certain issues. And one issue which comes very prominently is the issue of financing. So they make the argument that whenever, for example, there is a global crisis, global disruption, global financial challenges, their import needs are not easily possible because of the financing challenges they face, balance of payment crisis.
5 minutes left.
Okay. I will go quickly now. And then the last challenge I would say is some of the recent newer challenges, for example, sustainability. Anna was referring to that, and how these challenges, the new challenges, should be roped into the current negotiating conversation. And obviously, nobody can also neglect the current geopolitical challenges that we are fully aware of. People are members were recovering from the COVID pandemic, and then this geopolitical tension has also further complicated. Now, when we talk about okay, so I was just quickly, I will refer to the two main sort of challenges that we are facing in the domestic support or domestic subsidy negotiations, and which obviously have an important bearing on food security. One, as you may know, in the current framework, there is a sort of a distinction made between AMS, which is in simple term, which is a bigger amount of support, you can say, bigger amount of distorting support, and something called de minimis, which was supposed to be minuscule. That is how the origin of these terminology was in the Uruguay round, as in the agreement on agriculture. But now we are facing a situation, you can see in the chart, de minimis are in a way outgrowing the AMS, because de minimis, or the smallness, is compared to the value of production, and because of price evolution, because of the production evolution, these value of productions have been growing very fast, and which has made a situation when de minimis are now sometimes much bigger than what the AMS amounts are. So this is like one challenge which we are facing. On the other hand, it is also true that some countries are highlighting this issue, that AMS allows countries to concentrate support in specific products. So on the one hand, those countries who are bound by de minimis need to cap their support at only, say, 10% of the production if they are developing countries, but those who have AMS amounts in the schedule can sometimes subsidize up to 100%, 200% of the value of production of that product. So this is one very difficult debate that we are having and which is related to one type of sort of understanding in the rules and the current reality, which does not always reconcile. And the secondly, very quickly, the issue of public stockholding. You might heard a lot about it. Public stockholding is one of the programs which is acknowledged under what we call green box. That means unlimited support is allowed. The condition there is that this whole operation in terms of acquiring food and releasing food should be under market conditions, and then entire expenditure incurred will be green box. But developing countries have the possibility that they may do both sides of transaction under regulated prices. That means they may procure food at guaranteed or regulated prices and also release at a cheaper price, lower price for their domestic consumers. Now, then what happens? You can see in this graphic that release is not a problem, because that eventually is a consumer subsidy, which are in any case liberally treated under the WTO framework. But acquisition stage price support is going to be separately accounted for under the AMS. And as you may know, in WTO, there is a separate methodology for accounting for this support, which is called market price support, where the guaranteed prices or the regulated prices or the minimum prices are to be compared with a reference price which is fixed. And that issue is also causing concern, because if you look at that methodology, under that methodology, if you quantify support goes up much faster than, for example, the rate of increase in the prices. You may increase your support price by 10%, but subsidy may go up by, say, 50%, 60%. So those countries who are having de minimis limits, that means they have to cap their subsidies at a percentage of their value of production, and where the value of production will be going up as per the inflation or the price increase, but the subsidy may go up much faster, and which may reach a situation, which may lead to a situation of breach of their domestic support commitment. And that is fundamentally the issue members are grappling with. The proponents of this issue are asking for change in the methodology. On the other hand, the exporting countries have been saying that if we change the rule allowing unlimited support in the form of price support, it will lead to heavy distortions. And how do we deal with this equation of the debate? In 2013, members reached an agreement on this issue in the form of a peace clause, basically saying that no change in the rules, but if a developing country reaches a situation of breach of its commitment, that breach will not be legally challenged. They set up a time frame of 4 years to reach a lasting solution, or so-called permanent solution, which could not be achieved. And this is what is currently being dealt with. I think probably I will stop by having this last slide to show you that the latest conversation that we have in the WTO on food security is in the form of a work program on food security, which originated in the ministerial outcome at the previous meeting of the ministers in June last year in Geneva, where they agreed on a declaration on food security, which is also perhaps the first time the membership issued something collectively on holistically on food security. Because there has always been an hesitation among the WTO membership to deal with food security in a holistic sense because of the huge divergences they have. But this declaration is an important political statement of intent to anchor their, for example, policies on support, on export restrictions, and so on, to not to complicate, for example, global food security. This is a very important statement. And in the same declaration, they also asked the WTO Committee on Agriculture to engage in a food work program to examine food security concerns of least developed countries and net food importing developing countries. For the last 7-8 months, the committee has been dealing with it in a very intense manner. There is already an agreement on the thematic contours of that work program under food security. They are focusing on access to food market, that means functioning supply chains. Financing is coming in a big manner, which may be a topic of interest to you. Agricultural and production resilience or productivity, and then some horizontal issues where international agencies are expected to collaborate much more actively. This document GAG 35, which you see on the screen, contains that agreed work program. And now currently the members are trying to come up with some common recommendations on this theme. The deadline is November. The chairman or the coordinator of this process, who just left Geneva, he released a report containing a sort of broad element which could form up those potential recommendations. The new coordinator who had taken over just a few months ago, he will now carry it forward, and we hope to achieve something out of this process. I will stop here. I'm sorry I took probably some extra time. I will be happy to take some questions. Thank you so much. Thank you so very much.
Gracias, Diwakar, por tu presentación, por el framework que has hecho sobre el tema. Bueno,
Thank you, Diwakar,
la
for your
actualización
presentation,
que has
for
hecho al
your
final,
update
actual.
at the end.
Ahora, bueno,
And now
a Paolo Giordano.
I will give the floor to Paolo Giordano. He will give a presentation of the Latin America perspective on food security. Paolo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Thank you, Diwakar, for your introduction on Geneva. I'm going to give you a different angle from, I will give you Latin America. Yes, now, yes. Well, good everybody. Good morning, everybody. I see some friends here in the chat. And thank you, Ana Vasco, for inviting us to this presentation. Thank you, Esteban, for moderating. I would like you to give a view of this topic from Latin America, and I will start from the point of view of the bank, the point of view of the institutional bank, the IDB, and this new administration. The idea of food security is a priority. It's an institutional priority, and we have different aspects, and I would like to introduce them. I will start with a graph, with a chart that introduces what Diwakar mentioned. Trade is key in affecting four aspects of food security. The ones in red, he focuses on availability of food products, agricultural products, but access is also important because agricultural products produce income, and with that income, people can buy food. And that for Latin America is very, very important. Something that is not as relevant as the utilization, positive or negative in terms of trade, but it's also very important stability. I don't go into detail because Diwakar talked about that, but this explains why the bank puts a lot of emphasis, not just food security for importers, how to solve through trade the problem of food security for those countries who rely on imports to get food, but the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, when they export, because they are food exports, that contribute to food security. So we have those two coins, a side of the coins, and not that we see from the bank, and not just from the bank. We have along the FAO, the PAL, and other institutions to tackle this conversation and this issue and to try to analyze this topic, private and public sector to work together. So this is my motivation, how we enter forcefully. And why now? Because the starting point, I think, is to notice that invasion to Ukraine, we have had a price shock in the last 30 years. On the left, you can see the food price, and you can see that this is not the first crisis on global food security. We saw that in 2008, 2007, 2011, and we saw very clearly in 2022 after the invasion of Ukraine. What is new here in this event is not just food prices increased, and also fertilizers products, just not just in supply and demand. We have a supply shock, and while countries in the region need fertilizers, so this increase in prices affects competitiveness in the region. And that allows me to say something that is important. As we saw in 2008 and 9 and 2011, this spotlight of the international community on price crisis, then it diminishes when prices start going down. That is what is happening now. That's the reason why from the bank we want to focus on strategic aspects, but also structural aspects. So that is to say how the agricultural sector can contribute in the long term to the recovery of the region. Now, Diwakar talked about this in a general way, the adoption of restrictive trade measures. Here, what you can see is restrictive measures that were adopted in a few months before the crisis last year. And as you can see, you have measures of prohibitions of imports and tariff that fertilizers and food sector. So the trade policy is part of the problem in the food crisis. Now, Latin America, we generally think we take Latin America as part of the solution because this he is export a lot of food products. But if you go into detail, you can see that on the chart of the left, this traffic light system that shows that the deficit, and the agricultural products in Latin America, generally in food and different aspects of food. It is not all green. That is to say, first point is that there are many countries in general terms, the region is a super avid, agricultural trade super avid, with more than $127 billion in exports. And it is one of the more surplus area in terms of per capita, but there are countries who are net importers of food products, mainly Caribbean countries and some countries in Central America. Second, when we see every sector, there's no country who is all an import of agricultural importer, except Argentina. So prices affect all countries in terms because they are net imports or net imports of some categories. And besides, the region relies on fertilizers imports. So from a supply point of view, we need, we depend on, and that creates vulnerability. We become vulnerable. So on the left, you can see all the agricultural products, or on the right, you have agricultural products such as cereals, oils, oilseeds, and meat. And these are one of the most important products, and we can see the increase there was last year. And the Central American countries and the Caribbean were hit by this. That was affecting more than the rest of the region, but the increase affected everybody. Apart from the increase in agricultural commodities during 2022, that coincide with transportation of freight costs. So we came from the pandemic, and that was related to the destruction of global value chain, the imbalance in container management during the pandemic. And in 2022, at the beginning of 2022, when we had the explosion of agricultural prices, this disorganization of the global value chain was starting to recovering. So, and that was a factor that put a lot of pressure on prices. So how you perceive from Latin America, how they could see this prices, increase in prices. Inflation also rocketed, and the consumption price index also played an important role in inflation in households. In poorer countries, households had a higher incidence, because that is normal, because in poor households, they spend more on food than in households with more income. And this is very important. We believe in the bank that we need to work on this agenda to protect the most vulnerable ones. As I said, the trade policy is part of the problem, and you can see this on the right, where you can see food share before the crisis, that were restrictions on imports in terms of exports, sorry, in terms of imported calories. 20% of the products that provide calories to consumers were affected by some restrictions. But at the same time, on the right, you can see that in many cases of different foods and fertilizers, the countries took measures that alleviate price increase. For example, tariff reductions, stimulus programs, or direct sales. So the trade policy shouldn't be seen as only as a problem that generally in Geneva they take this side, but it can be part of a solution. And we try here at the bank to work with other countries so this can be a contribution to the solution. As I said, Latin America doesn't or shouldn't see inside Latin America, because Latin America can be part of the solution for the world. You can see the agriculture balance of trade, and what is highlighted is the superávit of Latin America. You can see 2009, 2011, 2019. These are observed information. This is observed information. In 2019, 2021 was the superávit region, and this will be it is estimated that this goes on until 2031. So you can see that Latin America plays an important role. Argentina and Brazil, mainly, principally, which are the net exporters, and they play a very important role in terms of food security. If you see on the right, to feed the world, to be able to feed the world, we need to produce. And what we have seen in the bank report at the bank, and we documented in last year's issue, and we are going to document that with more detail in this year's issue that we are preparing, Mrs. Michalczewski and Rosario Campos. So we are going to focus on competitiveness that Latin America has. If you see in green segments of primary products or agriculture manufacturers, you can see that in some cases we gain competitiveness. In primary products, we lost competitiveness. We lost that capacity to dispute market quotas to tertiary markets. And the reality of the region is very different. We have, for example, countries such as Mexico or Brazil that have gained competitiveness in terms of agricultural products. Other countries have lost competitiveness in primary products and agricultural manufacturers. So it's not enough to say that we are an exporting region and that we can contribute to food security, but we need to carry out different tasks inside the countries and with trade partners, international trade partners, so the region can be a solution to the food security problem. So I will try to close up so we can have more time for questions. We see that we have some measures that the governments or the members can take to alleviate the crisis in the short term, such as implement facilitation measures and reduce cost, trade cost, improve access to funding, financing, and diversify the sources of food and fertilizer supply. And if we want to be competitive to feed the world, we have other challenges. Maybe they are more complex, but not less important. The first one here is what Diwakar was saying, is the work in the WTO to foster a free trade, food and fertilizers free trade. There has been limited progress in terms of Latin American countries in the Uruguay round. And it's been a problem to make progress in the last 30 years. So it is essential to negotiate market access conditions, more favorable access, market access for the countries of the south of Latin America, the implementation or the closing of the agreement between South America and the European Union, that is going to be key. Then we need to contribute to market transparency, and Diwakar said this. There is a neo-protectionism that is emerging in food products, is what we know as, for example, the green squeeze, the green pressure. There are a lot of demands on producers, and they have to do with deforestation, climate change. But if they are more, they become obstacles. So the way that we are going to determine if Latin America is going to help is to see if they can increase, Latin America can increase their capacity in agricultural value chains, not just primary products, but also in the production of more added value products and spillovers and in the value chain. We need to reduce trade costs through investment in a hard and soft infrastructure, maritime roads, and also soft infrastructure. All the regulatory framework that regulate international trade, as Diwakar said, in terms of sanitary and phytosanitary things, we need private or green standards that are essential. And the public sector is key, and they have to improve these agencies and need to increase the capacity to meet high quality standards and environment standards too. And I think we need to foster and to fight for those standards not to be over protectionistic. So the countries of this region need to understand these new rules and all the conditions that exporters will be required. And finally, we'll go to international producers and national governments that need those systems of the certification of these standards. And finally, if the region exports 14% of its total exports of food products, if we see from an imports point of view, the countries of the region export 40% of their food, so their products. So this regional trade is very important in terms of the regional food security, but also for the competitiveness of the region. And some of the results that I have shown show that we have lost competitiveness in with our partners in Latin America against external players, for example, the European Union or the United States in our market. So in that case, we need to work really hard, and we are about to publish Rosario Campos and Romina Gachard with them and with ICA, with CEPAL, with FAO to raise this conversation. And this will be published in next few weeks. I hope this presentation has put the context, in context, the situation that had taken place in Geneva, and I hope I have been able to express the IDB intention on the agenda. This agenda is not from the countryside, inside. We need to work on food elements that have to do with production, and we need to pay attention to all the aspects that make that are relevant to the movement of those products in the world and in the region. So as in this case, we will contribute to progress. Thank you, Paolo, for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. We have just a few questions for just a few minutes for questions. A question for Diwakar. I've got the questions on the chat. The case of food security is cross-cutting some international agencies. In January, we had the Global Forum for Food and Agriculture in Berlin, the WTO, FAO. How is the coordinated work of the WTO with other agencies in order to make a progress with food security, global food security? How is the work concerted?
Oh, it's okay now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, because I think I was not able to unmute myself.
No podía desmutear.
Okay, so thank you. I think thank you very much for this question. And as I was saying in the very beginning that this is such a broad theme, multifaceted theme, that the coordination and collaboration is the key. Now we have two, I think, mechanisms to coordinate with other organizations. One is within the committee itself. Like for example, in the WTO Committee in Agriculture, within the structure itself, we have 6 international agencies which are regular or permanent observers to the committee. So every committee meeting we invite them, so which include IMF, World Bank, FAO, UNCTAD, International Grains Council. So these 6 agents and also one ad hoc observer, which is ICA from a region. So all these agencies are invited to each of our meetings, and on food security debate, they actively contribute. So that is one sort of modality that we have within the structure of the committee. And the second is that at the level of our Director General and the senior management, we maintain very close collaboration with other agencies. You might have heard about this, the modality of joint statement. Our Director General with IMF, with World Bank, FAO, and World Food Program, I think they have already released 3 joint statements where each have been recalling what is going on in their respective organizations and how collectively they see the way forward. So these are, I think, primarily the 2 ways where we maintain a sort of close collaboration. We also, I think, work collectively on joint reports. For example, we have done a joint report with FAO on fertilizers, on food security, and so on. So this is how I can say about our efforts to collaborate with other agencies. I will stop here. Thanks.
Gracias, Diwakar. Acá tengo una pregunta
Thank you,
para
Diwakar.
Paolo, de
I
José
have
Luis
one
Valentini.
question for
Pregunta, los países en
Paolo.
vía de desarrollo con problemas de liquidez de sus reservas internacionales de divisa.
Developing
¿Cuáles son las mejores
countries with
alternativas que
liquidity
tienen para conseguir
problems, what
financiamiento
are the
a
best
tasas bajas y al
alternatives
mayor plazo
and
posible con el fin de
to
ayudar a
get
la
low
seguridad
rate
alimentaria? Y ahí
financing?
sumo la
And
cuestión del financiamiento también
I
para los
can
estándares. Él decía, Paolo, que los
add
países tienen que poder
the
adoptar el
financing
marco
for
del cambio
standards that the
climático. Así que
countries
bueno, esa
need
es la
to
pregunta,
adopt in terms
Paolo.
of climate change. That is the question.
Bueno, sí, claramente el problema del
Well,
financiamiento es un
the
problema
funding problem
central,
is
es un problema
a
central
key
que
issue
inclusive se complica en la coyuntura
that
actual, una coyuntura de
is
aumento de
complicated even
las
more
tasas
now because there's an
internacionales, de
increase
aumento
in the
también, en
rates,
particular de
because
la región,
there's an
digamos,
increase in
América
risk
Latina,
in
lo
the
que
region,
lo cual
particularly Latin America.
es innegablemente un problema.
This is a
Yo
problem.
obviamente puedo responder desde
Of
el
course,
punto de
I
vista del
can
banco. El
answer
banco sí
from the point
proporciona
of view of the bank. The bank
tasas la
provides
más baja posible
the
para el
lowest
financiamiento
possible
de los
rates
gobiernos
for
y
government
facilita también
financing,
el
and
financiamiento del
in a
sector privado.
certain
El
way,
banco también
the
proporciona,
private sector.
digamos,
The
otros
bank also
mecanismos de apoyo que van
provides
más allá del
other
financiamiento o que
support
permiten
mechanisms
apalancar el
that
financiamiento para tener
go
impacto.
beyond
Es decir,
mechanisms that go beyond
todo el trabajo que
financing.
hacemos de
All the
asistencia
work, for
técnica,
example, we do
tanto a
technical
los gobiernos
support
como
to
a las pequeñas
governments
empresas
and
y también el trabajo
holdings,
analítico
business
que el banco
holdings, and
trata de
also the
promover
analytic work that the bank
y de diseminar en la
proposes
región de
and
manera
spreads in the
de
region
tratar de apoyar a la región con una
so
oferta
as to
integral donde vemos que las
support the
alternativas que
region
proporciona el banco
in an
es
a comprehensive
ciertamente el
way.
financiamiento, pero sobre todo
So
un financiamiento que
this is
vaya de la
funding.
mano de
The bank
asistencia
is
técnica y negocio.
funding and plus
Gracias,
assistance,
Paolo. Una
technical
más también
and
para Paolo.
analytical
Pregunta Onan Sánchez.
assistance. One more
Dice un
question
informe
for
de la
Paolo.
ONU en enero de
According
2023
to the
mencionó el
UN
derecho de los hogares de América
report,
Latina y Caribe al
um,
acceso a una dieta alimenticia saludable.
a
¿Cree que es
percentage
posible
of
llevar
Latin
toda esta
American and
ventaja
Caribbean
nutricional a cada país con
householdings
soluciones
don't
innovadoras y
have
tecnológicas saludables? Es la
dietary,
pregunta sobre el rol de la
don't meet
tecnología en la
dietary
oferta alimentaria.
needs?
Claro, es una muy buena
Yes,
pregunta.
it's a very good
Yo creo que sí,
question.
ahí está la clave,
Yes,
porque
there you have
fíjate
the
que,
key.
digamos, obviamente mi presentación iba muy
Of
rápido,
course,
¿no?
my
Entonces, como
presentation
yo le hacía
was
énfasis de cómo la
very
región
quick.
es una
So
región
I showed
excedentaria
that
y de
the
cómo podemos
region
y de cómo tenemos mucho
has
potencial para
superávit, and
alimentar
we
al mundo.
have potential to
Obviamente,
feed the world.
la
Of
frontera agrícola
course,
en ciertos países
the
es una frontera
agricultural
agrícola que es fuerte,
border,
pero
we
claramente,
have different
digamos, la
borders,
expansión
but
de
the
la frontera agrícola no se puede dar
the
más
agricultural
de una parte de
border expansion can not just give one part of the food that can feed the world. So the technological solutions or solutions that can increase productivity and above all save water consumption, forest consumption, resource consumption that are so important for environmental security is key. So technology is in the key of the challenge, plays a key role, and this is related to what we mentioned before, how we finance these technological advances, but not just with money, but support. But another way of doing this is support, technical support, research support, and application of the scientific research on trade solutions. But we are convinced here at the bank that this is essential for food security, not just in this region, but in all the world. Well, we have run out of time. There are a lot of questions, more than 200 active participants from different parts in the world, especially Latin America. So just to be fair with time, the presentations were so enriching and interesting. Please have a look at the following talks that we will have here at INTAL for the IDB and other activities that INTAL proposes to different public and trade, not just international trade. Thank you, Diwakar. Thank you for your time. We know that you're very busy there in Geneva. Paolo, thank you for providing us with the bank perspective. Please